Yeah, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to respond. It seemed to me that in looking at the CRT analysis that in large part, it conveyed to me a feeling of abuse of other people, that it was premised on a structure of abuse. And I'm struggling with the idea of how we get from a structure that's based primarily on abuse and kind of instrumental utilization of other people to a position of compassion. And, you know, kind of just to go back on a visceral level, you know, my reaction to image number 2 was one of, I want to get in that guy's face, you know, pardon the expression.
No, no worries.
And, you know, that's something that you feel pretty deeply in response to that. I mean, I mentioned in the comment, you know, fight or flight, right? I mean, that's the immediate reaction to that. So how do you move from there and in a system where it's basically structured on abuse of other people for the benefit of the abuser to something that has a compassionate basis? And I don't see how you get there from here. So that's the question, I guess.
No,
So
go ahead, Seth.
So I think your visceral reaction is thank you for mentioning that, because I think that resonates with a lot of people. And what we want to point out is that that kind of visceral reaction, which I notice within me as well, to act out in those ways is exactly what white nationalists are trying to get you to do. That's playing their game, because that confirms their worldview. It confirms that we live in a violent world. And it justifies their violent response, because see, you're violent too. You do this exact same thing. And so what we're trying to do is step out of this system entirely, and to find another way to do this rather than continuing a cycle of violence or replacing one regime with another. We're trying to create an alternative way of being in the world. This is what King was really getting at. And he pissed off a lot of people when he started really talking about it this way. And Chris, I mean, you can say more about that. And then, so how do you connect compassion to critical race theory? So that's a really important question. And so, Chris, I mean, I have some thoughts, but Chris, I'm really curious about your perspective.
Yeah, and Joe, what I hear you saying is something we're going to cover in, I guess, the session where we get to compassion for the other, because we will talk about how to have compassion, or how to cultivate a compassionate space, even for people we call difficult others, right? In the Bible, it's called enemies. I like the term, and we've had other people that point out difficult others is probably more helpful. And I don't want to pretend to say that it's easy, but I do want to say that as a BIPOC person, what I have come to realize is that if I acknowledge or promote a kind of dehumanization of anyone, that it's a tacit allowance for people to dehumanize me. And so if I want to eliminate the logic of dehumanization, I can't dehumanize anybody. It's the only way I can actually give myself and be seen as a full human being, is to make sure that all people are seen as a full human being. And so because I start from there, that helps me to not be enmeshed in my reaction. I guess what I'm trying to say, because I still have that same reaction, but it helps me to not be enmeshed in that reaction. What I want to talk about specifically is the role CRT does for me for self-compassion. And then as we move forward through this process, Joe, I want to come back to the part about the compassion for the difficult other, because it is, I would argue, critical for this to be sustainable, for this work to be sustainable, is we have to be compassionate towards ourselves as we do this work. And we have to find a way to humanize this person, even if they're wrong. And humanizing them and having compassion for them does not mean that we justify their actions. It does not mean that what they're doing is right, or it does not mean that what we're saying or what they're saying has to even be given an equal voice, right? Like, it doesn't mean that, but it does mean that I see them as a full human being and the complexity they're in, and that I'm not gonna create a space for them to be dehumanized. So where does CRT, for me, come with self-compassion? Is that for me, it allowed me to actually see the world as I thought it was. It helped me see, like, oh, this is what I intuitively knew, that it's structurally racist, that there are ways in which people benefit from racism, that psychologically, even if they don't benefit monetarily. It helps me understand, like, the notion of interest convergence, that people aren't always doing the thing because it's the right reason. And so for me, it gave me the space to say, yeah, those interior movements that I have, those are legitimate and those are real. And I don't have to feel like I'm crazy because of the stuff I say, right? At the same time, for someone who's not BIPOC, I can see how this can bring up all manner of things of saying, because it can be worldview destroying. But if you've already gotten to that point where you recognize this is the system, what I would suggest, and what I suggest to all of us, is that we are all complicit and caught up in this structurally racist system. And then in those moments where you see yourself participating in it or knowing it or not naming it, that you have to have some kind of practice or some process to step back and say that this isn't totality of who I am. This isn't totality of all my being. And I need to have a way to I can tend to those inner stirrings, those interior movements as they arise, so that I can continue to do this work. And so self-compassion, I would say, is fundamentally critical to doing any kind of justice work, but particularly important for doing racial justice work. Compassion for the other, super hard. I'm not even gonna tell you that it's easy. And when we get to it, as we learn, paradoxically, I guess the best way I can say it is, as the way in which you learn to have compassion for yourself, it increases your capacity of compassion for the other. And it's very paradoxical, but it totally works that way, and we'll get there. And so that's why I wanted to come to your question, because what you've hit at is the fundamental challenge I think we all face in today, is how can we extend compassion toward that difficult other, right? Seth, do you want to say just something briefly about how compassion doesn't normalize their or accept their behavior? And then we're gonna have to probably go 5 minutes over, guys. I'm really sorry, but I know we at least need to do one video practice, but I really think this is important for Seth to say something. And then I know Ruth raised her hand.
So questions that come up right now when we're talking about focusing on ourselves. Well, what about the guy in that racist image? Shouldn't he be held responsible? Aren't we just legitimizing what he's saying? And so that is absolutely not what we're saying. Compassion doesn't justify any sort of abuse. The problem is we have a misconception, like a popular level misconception of what compassion is. We usually think of it as either being nice or as empathy. And as we learned in Pulse, empathy is one small step of cultivating compassion. And so compassion is something much bigger, and it involves working from our empowerment. So taking time to cultivate compassion for ourselves is really the important first step. And that doesn't legitimize what other people are doing. We're just removing ourselves from the situation until we get our house in order, so that we can return to the situation and address it from a grounded perspective, from the truth of who we are, and on a firm foundation. So we'll talk about how to address other people and hold them responsible when we get to compassion for another, and then also in compassionate action. But it's important to point out that we're not talking about legitimizing what someone is saying, like all of the racist stuff that we see. That's not okay, and compassion doesn't justify that. And if it did, we wouldn't be using compassion. So